Thank you all so much for joining us. On behalf of the Grantmakers for Education team, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Toward Languages of Liberation in Learning Environments. My name is Stephanie Waller. I'm the Program Director for Grantmakers for Education, and we're so excited to bring you this second conversation in our 5-part series, connecting the dots on early learning, identity development for children and youth, and what it looks like to fully affirm and celebrate a young person's cultural identity, and how that relates to promoting democratic ideals. Today's session will feature some expert practitioners speaking to this issue from the lens of language development and identity development in young people. And we're so honored to be putting on this webinar as part of the series in partnership with Early Childhood Funders Collaborative and Trust for Learning. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce my colleague Ellen Roche from Trust for Learning to talk a little bit more about our series and to introduce our moderator for this afternoon. Ellen, please take it away.
Thanks, Stephanie, and good to see everybody joining in the chat. Feel free to let us know where you're calling in from. So I'm not sure how many people were able to make the first session in the series last month, but we had a great conversation on July 11th, less than a month ago, kind of kicking off this series. And I don't know if anybody else is following sort of the national political landscape, but I was reflecting that a lot can change in a month. You know, July 11th was a very different day than today in terms of what is possible in this country. So one of the inspirations for this series was the idea that democracy itself, meaning the values that we aspire to, is very much in development, right? That for people in our generation, at least the way that I'm thinking about it, that we shouldn't be thinking about saving democracy if we've never actually had a fully flourishing democratic life in this country and on this land. So I'm instead trying to support myself to think about continuing the work toward shared values of democracy in terms of freedom and justice and equality. I work for an organization called Trust for Learning, where we do something similar in terms of children's early learning environments. We aspire to learning environments that are aligned with developmental science and what we want for young children, the expertise of educators, that are all sort of oriented toward 9 key principles of development: racial equity, play, relationship. So I just wanted to kick off with a couple of factoids from developmental science to keep in mind as we think about how to strengthen and build a free, multiracial, multicultural society from this point on as the adults in the room at this sensitive period in democracy. So just if you are willing, I'd be curious to have people enter into the chat. How old were you the first time you were offered any other language besides English in a publicly funded learning environment? So I was 12, I was in 7th grade, the first time I had an opportunity to learn anything but English. So how old were you? 5th grade, 6th grade, 5? Awesome. Feel free to pop those in the chat. 14. So one of the fun kind of factoids from developmental science that hopefully will inspire this conversation. So sensitive periods in human development, periods when it's really important for children to get particular inputs to bring a system online for language, begin at birth. So infants arrive to us already recognizing and preferring their own dialect and language from hearing the prosody of their parents' voices while they're in utero, right? By the end of the first year of life, there are already sensitive periods of language starting to close, right? Of course, we can learn language later in life, but I'm an early developmental researcher, and the earlier we can support children, the better. So keeping that kind of in mind. The other kind of fun factoid is this idea of developmental cascade. So moments in human development when one system changes and it creates a cascade in all kinds of other systems. One of the best studied examples of this is when children go from crawling to standing up and walking. So in that moment when they start to toddle, their language explodes, right? They can see so many different things that they can talk with their families about. Their vision development changes, their motor development changes. So development happens every single day, but there are also these incredibly important pivot points where complex systems start to change. So I am thinking about this moment in our democracy in terms of being both sensitive and having the potential for actual cascading change. So of course, the invitation in this series is for philanthropic funders to think about how we can participate in advancing those cascades toward freedom, toward justice, toward the values that we're going to talk about on this call. So with that, I will introduce my colleague Shantel Meek, and I will give a fuller sense of her biography because she has so many different hats that she wears. Shantel Meek, Dr. Meek is a professor of practice and the founding executive director of Children's Equity Project. She's also a member of the Ideal Learning Roundtable and a collaborator of ours at the Trust frequently. So before she founded Children's Equity Project, Shantel served in the Obama administration, and she was an advisor for education at the White House, as well as serving in the Department of Health and Human Services. So she also serves and has served on councils for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She's published pieces in publications like the New York Times and Washington Post. She serves on boards including Child Trends and the Pyramid Model Consortium. Her BA is in psychology, and she has an MS and PhD in family and human development from Arizona State. And Shantel, I'll let you share anything else that you'd like to about your background and what brings you to the conversation. Thank you for moderating this conversation.
Thanks, Ellen. It's always so awkward sitting here when your bio is being read out loud, so I'm so glad that's over. But I am gonna start by talking a little bit more about myself and my family's experiences, not the degrees and the work stuff, because I think that funnels into who we are and our work and how we approach the work and our perspectives. So excited to be here with you all today to talk about an issue that is near and dear to my heart, personally and professionally. Language justice is just an area that's too often overlooked and seen as kind of tangential to broader equity efforts, and it shouldn't be. As some of my friends on this call who know me know, I'm Mexican American and I grew up in a small town on the US-Mexican border. It's this beautiful, unique little corner of the country where bilingualism is the norm. Nearly everybody is Mexican or Mexican American and bilingual or Spanish dominant. I could actually see the border friends from my backyard growing up, and you go to McDonald's and they're just as likely to take your order in Spanish as they are in English. Like, it's just really a unique place where there isn't that social hierarchy and structure of language. And it's a good place to grow up. Many families of Mexican origin and with Mexican roots have been there for generations, right? In fact, there's a saying that they didn't cross the border crossed them. My grandparents on both sides immigrated to that town from Mexico in the 50s, leaving families behind in northern Mexico. Both my parents were raised in Arizona in the 60s and 70s, but spent a lot of time kind of going back and forth. It was much easier in the years before 9/11 to do that. But life in the US, you know, for immigrant families and for those who are learning English, wasn't easy those days. It's not easy today. My grandparents spoke exclusively Spanish at home, but there were a lot of schools that were really strictly English only, including my mom's. She tells us these stories of school growing up, right? If a kid let a Spanish word slip in class, they would be corporally punished. So teachers and administrators would use this thick piece of wood about a foot long and hit kids at the top of the hand after they had their first slip of a word in Spanish. And after the third time, they'd have to turn over and be hit with a stick on their bottoms. And that happened to my mom, right? And it wasn't that long ago. And it still impacts her today. So it's going to share just a couple of slides here to show. Just last weekend, we were at her house, and let me see. And my son found this piece of wood that had fallen off a piece of furniture or something, and he brought it to her. He's like, no, where's this from? And it just took her back immediately to that time in school when, imagine all you hear at home, right, 24/7 at home is Spanish, and then you go and you have to, like, there's this literal stick, right, threatening a word from coming out. So language has not only been criminalized in schools and punishable by physical hits, but used as a tool for segregation, right? In the 20th century and before that, right, California and states in the Southwest established Mexican schools where they segregated kids of Mexican origin or kids whom they perceived to fit that bill, so that white children wouldn't have to go to school in the same buildings with them, right? And they use language as the justification for that, right? They need to learn English, so we got to put them over here in this building over here. In 1946, parents fought back through the courts, and in this case, it's Mendes versus Westminster, the courts ruled that it was unconstitutional based on the Equal Protections Clause. And this case became one of the early cases that then helped set the judicial precedent in anticipation of Brown that came a few years later. But the racialization of language and how it's been built into systems of white supremacy go way back before the founding of the nation, right? It played a role in land theft of indigenous people, where it wasn't an accident that the treaties that the US made and broke with indigenous tribes were in English. It wasn't an accident that when indigenous children were stolen from their families, they were forced to learn English and leave behind indigenous languages and cultures. And all of this has a theme, right? There's like a commonality here. Stripping away language because it's a part of a person's soul, right? It's part of who you are. It's how a new mom communicates with their baby and how a grandparent and elder share stories with their grandchildren and their communities. It's really part of your soul. And stripping it makes you feel like you have a hole inside. So heartbreakingly, I sent my daughter off to school today where she's just going to speak and hear English. And she's going to have Spanish words in her mind, right? And she won't be corporally punished if it slips anymore, but they'll have to stay inside, right? And so she can't fully express the whole repertoire of what she feels, of what she thinks, of what she knows, right? And I can only hope as a parent that that's not going to be permanently harmful. So when we think about language justice, I think there's 3 ways that we kind of conceptualize it at the CEP. I think the first way is really thinking about and prioritizing the kids who really don't speak English, right? Who don't hear it at home, who don't understand it. Because for this group of kids, dual language education or education in the home language necessarily is required for equal access to educational opportunities, period, right? So tell me how they have equal access to a curriculum if it's in a language they don't understand, they're not familiar with. Tell me how they have equal access to the teacher. Tell me how their parents have equal access to impacting school rules and policies and advocating for them when it's all in a language that they don't understand, right? So for this group of kids, it's really about like the core baseline that this country says we have or we should have, which is equal education access for all. And I think to Ellen's point earlier, this is the same for democracy, right? How can we have a free democracy, a free functioning multiracial, multicultural, multilingual democracy when they're by design, it's in English, right? And so many people are excluded from participating in that. Today, only about 8% of kids who are classified as English learners are in dual language education. Despite, I'm really grateful Ellen shared a lot of the research on bilingualism and brain development, and I don't have to go over like why that's a good thing and why that's important. But despite knowing that, right, we have this massive divide. And I think in education research, it's one of the largest disconnects between what we know is right, what we know works, and what's actually done. And we have to assume that that divide exists on purpose, right? I think the second piece we need to think about is kids who might know English, right? They might live in bilingual households, or they might just live in English-speaking households, but have a language that is connected to their culture, connected to their communities, connected to their identities, connected to who they are, have roots in different places, right? Like I said, language is part of our souls. And for these kids, sure, they might be able to understand the teacher who speaks English, but they might leave a big piece of themselves at home or in their heads, right? Or in their communities. And what is that feeling like for them at school? What is the social emotional impact? What are their feelings of belonging and contribution? What are their feelings of self-esteem and self-identity and knowing who they are, right? And this is where a lot of Indigenous children fit in as well, right? This is where my kids fit in. Their dad speaks English, I speak Spanish. It's part of, right? And and a lot of kids, immigrant kids who are in further out generations. And I think third, the last kind of group or chunk, right, is this topic of enrichment, right? Dual language for enrichment. And this is often the only thing we assume and think about when we're talking about dual language learning. And typically it's enrichment for higher income white English speakers, right? Leaving aside the true equity issues, which are the ones that I mentioned before. So enrichment is good and fine, but not if it's the only thing we're focused on, and not if it's at the expense of opportunities for kids who have been historically marginalized because of their language, or who have had their language stripped over the course of history, right? As an intentional tool to marginalize. But even thinking about the enrichment dimension, again, we need to think about the equitable distribution of enrichment and ensure that kids who have been historically marginalized and historically excluded from dual language opportunities get access first. This includes kids with disabilities who are often left out, right? This includes Black children and other children of color who speak English at home. This includes lower income children. So now that we have that context, let's talk about the what now, and kind of where are the pieces where we need to be thinking about investments. And I'm not just going to start by doing a little focus on Arizona because I live here and my kids go to school here and I'm from here and I have a deep tie to here, but it also happens to be the last remaining English-only state in the nation. Proposition 203 has been in place for a quarter of a century here. And before Prop 203 was in place, we had things happening like what happened to my mom in Arizona schools, right? Like it's never been great. But for over a quarter of a century, it's been the law of the land that kids who are English learners are segregated for about 4 hours every day for English instruction. So if you think about the length of a school day, it's like 6 or 7 hours, right? You put in lunch, recess, transitions, and then 4 hours, right? What time does that leave for math or science or social studies or anything else, right? When we think about our neighbors in the region, right, Texas is in a way different place. They passed the Bilingual Education Act in the 80s, requiring districts to offer ELs pre-K through 12 bilingual education if there's a certain number of kids. Utah took more the enrichment model, but still because the population is much lower, it has resulted in more dual language opportunities for their ELs in the state. If you think about the populations in both of those states, Utah versus Arizona, Utah has about 119 dual language elementary schools compared to Arizona, which has about 29, despite having over 40% more students and many, many, many more ELs. This is kind of a fuzzy picture, but Unidos US put together this profile that looked at reading scores and compared those regional states. And of course, Arizona is at the very bottom and has been for a long time, and it's not surprising because of the policies that we've been seeing. We know that a decade-long study found that Prop 203 was ineffective in improving academic outcomes. No surprise, we already knew that. Widening significantly the gap between ELs and their peers in a number of outcomes. And today, Arizona has some of the lowest graduation rates for ELs in the whole country, right? And so all of these things kind of fit together. Those ideologies, those policies, those practices, those student experiences, and then those outcomes. I think that's kind of like my last thought before I provide some funder specific recommendations, but really the double standard of bilingualism in this nation is crystal clear, right? It's an enrichment and a benefit for kids who already speak English at home, generally are white and higher income. It's a deficit that must be extinguished at all costs for kids who speak a language other than or in addition to English at home, or who have a cultural tie to that language, right? Removing access for kids who have the most to gain, whether that is through basic access to education or whether that is for a full sense of belonging and freedom and liberation and self-worth, right? And reserving access exclusively for those English speakers who have not been historically marginalized, right, by language in the past, presents like the most clear as day inequity and right to education that we have in the nation. So in terms of just funder thoughts and recommendations, right, a focus on Arizona. And not because, again, not because I'm biased toward Arizona, but because it's an equity emergency. And if you care about these kids, if you care about this issue, it's kind of ground zero for that right now. Two, really thinking about funding federal policy work, targeting congressional reauthorizations that are coming up the pike, targeting budgets, right, and getting more funding. I think Title III from ESSA has been underfunded, chronically underfunded forever. And really doubling down on civil rights protections for these kids. Like, we have already established that it is unconstitutional to segregate kids as a matter of policy, right? What is the disconnect? Really thinking about funding state level policy to embed this issue and prioritize these kids in state level pieces. We know that, in some places, dual language education is really popular, but it's often not the language that is spoken in the community or wanted by the community. And we very often don't have equitable enrollment policies that actually prioritize and reserve seats for kids who have a cultural tie or speak the language at home. Really thinking about litigation in places where language equals segregation and equal opportunity is not being realized in education. Funding local leaders, some of who you're going to hear about today, who are making change in their community, in the lives of kids and families. Funding Indigenous language revitalization, maintenance, immersion efforts, and funding expansion of resources in Spanish, the most commonly spoken language, and many of the other additional languages spoken in the United States. There are many. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to move to our panel and our panel questions. So let us start at the top, and I'm going to let everyone introduce yourselves and share more about yourself, about the work you do, and what brings you to the work. Vanessa, a goal of yours is really to bring back the Dakota language, connected to tribal sovereignty work in Minnesota, and the current picture of first languages remaining in Minnesota. Can you talk to us a little bit, introduce yourself, tell us about yourself, what brings you to the work, and what work are you doing now?
Homidakuyapi ja hipikion Stefan, äskuttänä makiapi, Dakotia, snasnawi demie, chanshapi that she at home here. Wana chanshapi wa kanjo oyawa otie doanie, oyawa oi tancha hemachie. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa Goodthunder. My Dakota name is Snasnawi, which means jingling woman. And I come from the Lower Sioux Indian community. We call it Chanshayapi, where they paint the trees red, and it's in southwest Minnesota, but very rural Dakota tribal community. And we got to have the pleasure to open a birth to 5-year-old Dakota language school. And we opened it in August of 2018. And we're pretty excited. I think we are on, if we look at the expanded graded intergenerational disruption scale, so like, where are you on language revitalization so far? We are in level 8B, which is nearly extinct, because currently in the state of Minnesota, there are only 5 first language speakers who speak Dakota, and they're all over the age of 67. So we are in a race to bring back our language, and that's why we open doors with the mission to raise the next generation of Dakota language speakers. And this coming past 2 years, we've really been focusing on the teachers and the parents so that when they're ready to raise their babies or expand their families, they can expand it at home with the dominant language as Dakota. So those are just a little bit about us, and we're just really excited to be here.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you. Veronica, can we turn to you? I know that you do a lot of work in your community in Spanish language through culture, dance, and music. Introduce yourself and tell us about your work. What brings you to the work?
Thank you. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. Un placer y un honor estar aquí con todos ustedes. Soy mexicana, I am Mexican. I was born in Mexico and I grew up in a beautiful family, large family, where everybody talks to each other and support each other. They fight each other too. So with the language of the mother. And when I came to the United States, I'm a performer, a Mexican mariachi, and I share my culture since I'm 14 years old, promoting not only my culture, but then later on I got the opportunity to travel abroad and get to know other cultures from Latin America, all based in values that brings family together and respecting the community, respecting your elders, and communicating to each other. I came to the United States and I noticed a problem, many of the problems that we have as immigrants, that children didn't feel comfortable with their language or thinking that they came from another country that wasn't the United States. So the self-esteem was the first thing that I noticed about our kids. And I decided to start bringing programming, especially in Boston, Massachusetts. I am located in Boston, Massachusetts right now. I've been here for the past 24 years. And again, I saw the lack of representation of the cultures of the people from Latin America. And one of the social problems was that the bond with their parents was cut and interrupted by the language barrier, because they started speaking English and their parents didn't have enough vocabulary to pass on the values and to, and to be able to continue their education. So I think one of the main problems also, it's like the school system doesn't support the language neither, because they make you feel that you are dumb or you are not, as intelligent as the people that only speak English. And so the right of speak your own language is immediately taken away from as soon as you get into the school system, because they make you feel weird, they make you feel different, and they also segregate. I mean, they put you in other places apart. And that's why we decided to establish the Veronica Robles Cultural Center. We promote Latin American arts and cultures as an engine for stronger communities and economic growth. How we do that? By creating this vibrant, interconnected, and multi-generational community where all feel welcome and valued, and we empower to drive social change and community action through the diverse arts and cultures of Latin America. And we try to make sure that we first speak their own language, Spanish, because they will always speak English at school. So we try to support their parents. So because also the children that speak other language, they see speaking their language as a punishment, like, because people say if you speak Spanish, you're grounded. You have to speak English. So every time you try to tell your children to speak English, you're always taking away their language because they're going to be punished. So in the cultural center, we make them feel like we don't even make them feel that they are learning Spanish or fostering their language. We just do it. And if they don't speak Spanish and they're Latinos, we try to speak English just naturally as Spanish. We never point out that you don't speak Spanish or you don't speak English. And so they feel value when they go out there in the community representing their own cultures that make them feel proud. They can do it so in English or Spanish, and they're also not afraid of making mistakes speaking the language, whether it is English or Spanish or speaking Spanglish. Because later on, when they grow older, when they go to the university or college, they will perfect their Spanish or their English. And that's what we do that at Veronica Robles Cultural Center. We serve over 400 children, 4 years old all the way to 19 years old, and not only their families, the children, but the whole family. And that's what we do in Boston.
Thank you, Veronica. I'm going to go to you, Julie. Julie, you've been serving the Lakota community for 36 years. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about the work you do, and what brought you to the work.
So good morning, everybody. Yeah, I am Julie Garrow. I'm the founder and CEO of the Cheyenne River Youth Project. We are located on the Cheyenne River Reservation, mid-north central South Dakota. Our reservation is about 3 million square acres, so it's quite large. Over half our population, which I think is fairly consistent with other indigenous nations, over half of our population is under the age of 18. And so the Cheyenne River Youth Project has been working with young people ages 4 to 18 for many, many years. I think the reason I am engaged in this work is because I am the product of boarding schools. I was one of those kids. My parents were one of those kids where they were sent away, and it was just safer not to speak the language, not to dance, not to do anything that made you stand apart as a Lakota child. Um, I was on I would say the very end of the boarding school kind of era where my siblings were not, so they experienced a lot of the abuse. And so speaking our language just was not something that we were introduced to. And in fact, it was, my grandparents often, they didn't want you to learn because they understood what could happen. So I'm still very much in that healing process and learning and reclaiming. So I think what brought me to the work that I do with our young people is because they absolutely deserve to have access to that. That's, it's our cultural wellness that we're talking about. And we're talking about, access to learning language, but also access to pray the way that we know how to pray. Going to ceremony, access to all those things, that's part of our cultural wellness. And I think I always understood that because I have a very personal experience with that. I mean, you'll notice I did not introduce myself in my Lakota language. I was not raised in it. It's not mine. I've been still reclaiming and learning. And what I love, though, when I grew up, when I was out of the boarding school and I was in the regular public school systems, they didn't teach Lakota there either. And I would guess most indigenous language are at risk for being lost. I know that this is just not our story. So it is really important. And although we don't teach, we do teach Lakota language and culture as an internship for our teenagers. But what I love is that that's becoming a stronger part of our community and that reclamation. And so I often hear kids, and it's really encouraged for them to talk around, to use their language, and, they joke around. And, I'm very upfront about my history, about where I come from, because I think that that's the tragedy, right? That's the story. And I think it's important for them to know how necessary it is for them to reclaim. So in our organization, though, what is very much encouraged is, we're a nonprofit, yes, and we have all those structures that we need to pay attention to. But I think the one thing that's really beautiful and different with us is that we do encourage each other, to refer to each other as auntie or grandma or uncle in our Lakota language. So it's something that's just kind of happening naturally, and we let that just play out because what we have to do, what we know is that language reclamation in our community, it's not strong enough. But I think there's the other issues that are really very concerning is that the state of South Dakota does not want other South Dakotans or other kids and even our own children to learn what the history is. They don't want to know. They don't want to tell the story of what happened within our state. The massacres, those things are left out of textbooks because our children are required to use the state's codes, or, we don't have our own. They do teach Lakota language. I would not say not from the very beginning. It's not consistent throughout that entire period from, K through the 12th grade, and it should be. But, when we're talking about, I just never really understood why being Lakota was so bad or threatening. And, I love that I'm raising kids now who are, they're proud to be Lakota. They wear their braids. They love being, dark skinned. There's no shame in that anymore. I mean, there never was, but they were made to feel it. But yeah, I'm the kid who I got caught dancing once. And it's very familiar about your mother, the stick. I mean, they must have all taken a class on that's what we do with children, because I got caught dancing, and I got paddled for it. We were a bunch of little kids in a dormitory, and we were all crying because we missed home. Well, then of course the answer was, well, we're going to line them up and we're going to spank them all, and then they won't cry anymore. So those really hard, tragic events that occurred are still very much present. They're present because they're in me and my siblings. You know, it's still very much a part of who we are. So I think my motivation is because I think that our children should have access to everything, to every bit of who they are as Lakota people. And I'm a part of, you know, that kind of reclaiming that, encouraging cultural wellness, to just creating an organization, I think, that welcomes that. You know, I think that's probably why I work so hard to create safe spaces. You know, within our community, we still have a great deal of pain and hurt and social challenges, but there's also a really strong desire to reclaim, but that requires, it requires more time. You know, it's not a fast moving train at all. You know, it takes time to heal, because access to all that in the end becomes wellness. And through wellness, you know, we become whole people. You talked about how it's a part of our soul. Well, if it's not there, something's missing, and we're always looking. And I know this because I'm that kid. I grew up that child. So for me, you know, we talk about diversity and reclamation and all those things. And I think that that's kind of what we're doing at the Cheyenne River Youth Project. And we've been doing it because, you know, in the end, we want strong, healthy Lakota children. But we also need to, you know, we're very rural. We're a reservation community. There's the, you know, unfortunate part of, you know, we don't have access to resources. You know, economically, we don't have access to much. But, you know, I think that the work that we're doing, even if it's small steps, they're valuable steps. You know, and if you want, you know, recently our governor, Governor Noem, has really made some very harsh comments about the Native people of our state. And I just wish she understood that, you know, it's just not politics, just, you know, saying whatever you want to say. You're making more damages to kids. You know, the kids are sitting there like, why is she doing that? Why is she talking about us? So this is all health and wellness. It's language reclamation, but it is definitely the health and wellness of our young people and how they're going to move forward. They're creating unsafe spaces outside of reservations. And just yesterday, we were talking about, you know, sometimes we wish we could just bring all of our kids home to the reservation. Reservation life can be very difficult. It can be really hard, but it's home. And at least we know there it's okay to be Lakota. Whereas we have a state that's not welcoming to us. You know, it's like, I didn't realize this. My nephew, he graduated about 5 or 6 years ago, but he told me he was in his senior year. He said every single day somebody called him a prairie nigger. And when he told me, it broke my heart. And I was just so fired up. I'm like, do you want me to go to that school? And he said, no. He said, I'm almost done. I'll be done out of there. So he just took it until he didn't have to anymore. And then he left. So I just think our children are going through so much, and having access and really fully beginning to know who you are with language and ceremony and everything else, that who we are is so necessary. But, you know, often, you know, communities don't have the resources. Communities don't have, you know, they don't have the language teachers and speakers. So reclaiming all of that too, and is pretty integral to this whole wellness picture. And I think that's probably been my motivation about why I'm engaged in this work, because in the end, you know, the folks that we work with, the children we work with, the young people, they're not my clients. They're my relatives, like truly our relatives. So it's very different. And it is crisis. It is a crisis. We do have to work harder, and more resources have to come to our communities so that we can do it. And of course, we're doing everything we can, but it will take time. It does take time. And creating allies and supporters and building relationships with people who are truly invested. You know, language, it's justice. If we want true justice, then you need to help mend some of the damage that's done in these communities.
Thank you so much, Julie, for sharing your story and your experiences. I do want to lift up just a couple themes that I noticed. I think, the theme of corporal punishment, obviously I mentioned it, you just mentioned it, and it was widespread in Indigenous boarding schools. It still exists. Corporal punishment is still legal. I believe it's 19 states in public schools, and it's legal in 49 states in private schools. Still legal. Disproportionately applied, depending on the state. In some states that have higher proportions of Indigenous populations, Indigenous children are way overrepresented in corporal punishment. So this is not just a matter of history, right? I think it's tied and it continues and it's manifested in different ways. And so that's one piece that I think requires policy work, requires mindset shift, requires a whole bunch of pieces and efforts that funders can certainly jump into at the state level with targeted efforts. I think the history erasure that you started with is a really important point that is also a theme, and I think part of the playbook and strategy to continue to marginalize populations. In Arizona, just for example, the same state superintendent for public education that is vehemently against dual language instruction, but only for those who speak Spanish at home. He was the same superintendent that banned Mexican American ethnic studies for high school students in a predominantly Mexican American community. And we've seen examples of this across the country, erasing Black history, erasing Indigenous history, and so on. And I think, again, that is just one other strategy and tool. And so how do funders think about that and reversing some of those trends and making our own accurate textbooks on the market, right, that are available and accessible to folks to tell that accurate history. I think the last thing I'll mention, you mentioned the poverty and the needs and the lack of resources on reservations sometimes, right? And it is hard to do it, like reclaim the language and have that emphasis on language and culture and all of that when we are struggling to meet basic needs of food and shelter and electricity and running water and all of these pieces. And I think those anti-poverty efforts really with these other pieces in mind, I think are so important. So I'm gonna shift to the next question. And I'll start with you, Vanessa. I'll come back to you. Can you talk to me about what language as a right means from your perspective and in your work?
Yeah, and I think I'll just piggyback off of all these wonderful women here. I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head. It's, Dakota, for me, it's a part of me, and without it, I'm not whole. And when you think about it, here in Minnesota, tens and thousands of years ago, the land only knew Dakota language, and now there's only 5 first language speakers left in the state. If we really think, what happened, why, then we go into the boarding schools and we go into all of that. And when I'm thinking about it as a right, it is who we are. They tried to erase who we are and us. And just breathing is an act of fighting to continue on. And that's still true today. And I'm only 30 years old, and that's still true today for a younger person. At least my kids don't call me younger, not the kids here. They think I'm pretty old, but I am relatively historically young, I will say that. And going forward from that, I should be able to know who I am, and I should be able to know my relatives. I mean, there was a war here in U.S. Dakota War. If you haven't heard about it, look it up. It still has the United States' largest mass execution to date. Post the war, we still have the boarding school era. We had bounties on our heads, and that historically was not that long ago. And so it took a lot of resources and systems that worked to take our language away. So now that there's only 5 first language speakers left, it's going to take a lot more to bring it back. I mean, it just takes one generation to lose a language. It's going to take 3 to bring it back. And so I think it absolutely is our right to do so. And we just need the tools and the resources to continue to do something. And we're not recreating the wheel. We're just remembering, reclaiming and reconnecting, and then protecting and maintaining who we are. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Vanessa. Julie, can I go to you? What does language as a right mean?
I think we've said it already. Language as a right it's a part of our soul. It's what we should be allowed. We should have always been allowed to speak our language. It's a part of who we are. And it's not, language isn't separate from, say, culture. Language, ceremony, prayer, all those things, our spirituality, it's all our culture. It's all being a Lakota person. So it's not like you silo them out and say, well, that's one thing and this is one thing. It's all one big thing, and it's what makes us whole as Lakota people. So we really have to work to mend that. And I know that the language speakers that we work with, who come in and work with our young people, they're getting older. And so they feel like they just have this really strong, overwhelming need to carry this on, to tell the stories, to speak the language, because they know they're getting older. And then what happens after they're gone? So, it is a right that along with everything else, colonization really tried to take that away from us and make us one and the same. And I think that's just, it's horrifying, because it's, how uninteresting, number one, but as Lakota people, it makes us whole. And there's nothing grander to me, as somebody who was not allowed to grow up with it, than to hear our young people walking through the halls, like speaking in Lakota, even if it's a combination of, Lakota English, they're still doing it. And they know it. They know it. I may not have been allowed to know it, maybe their parents, but these kids, now in this current generation, they understand how that makes them whole in terms of being, a citizen of our Lakota nation. So it's, it's nothing you can separate out. It is a right. It is not only that, but it is mental health. It's physical wellness. It's a part of, again, I'll use that term, cultural wellness. I think it's all a part of that, and you can't separate it out. It just is. And I am certain somebody can come along and quote statistics and studies and all of that, but I can tell you right now, as a person who was not allowed, what that means to go throughout your life not having access. So it's tragic. It is tragic.
I just want to share, just, building on your point, Julie, and I know Shannon put something in the chat. What I mentioned at the beginning, that like this language piece is often like off to the side, right? And it's not integrated in broader funder efforts. So when we think about quality early care and education, when we think about ideal learning, when we think about trauma, when we think about mental health, when we think about home visiting, like all these are areas that different funders, educational equity, like have a role in, but language isn't always integrated, right? We need to stop talking about quality without this piece integrated. We need to stop talking about trauma and mental health without this piece integrated. We need to stop talking about ideal learning and all these other pieces without this integrated, right? Because it's a conceptualization that is incomplete for those of us, right? Who that's a part of who we are and our soul and our kids and all of that moving forward. I'm looking at the clock, and I do want to get to the last question. Veronica, I'm going to go to you first, since we haven't heard from you. What do you want funders to know about how to invest in this important work now? And I'm going to ask the same question to all three of you, if y'all want to start thinking about that one. I think you're muted.
Oh, yes. Thank
There
you.
you go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Well, so I would recommend the funders to take in consideration a little bit more about funding organizations that are grassroots created and funded by the communities, and not by the big organizations of people that really want to do well, but they don't really know the community. So because I see myself as an immigrant Mexican in New England, it's been really hard for me. It was until the pandemic that I noticed all the work that I do as an artist, investing myself in my community, and in seeing that there's a lot of support, but for me was a barrier because I didn't speak the language. So to write the grants, to have the text written in a way that sometimes the funders or the people who puts out together all these opportunities. So I didn't have the language to write it the right way, the way they wanted to hear for, So I would recommend it to make it more accessible for people that speak other languages, including the Native American languages, and also to consider more funding for the cultural responsive programming in our communities. Talking about language, language is a right. Language, parents have the right to speak their language to their children, and children should have the right to continue fostering and learning that language. So I would really recommend that, and also to get a little bit more informed about the communities they are serving. Because, for example, I always put an example, like if I write a grant about my cultural dance, which requires a large, wide, long skirt, that it is made by the art crafters from our countries. So it takes a lot of time for us to connect those people. We want to pay a fair price for their work and then to ship it back here in the United States. And then when we ask for a skirt or a cultural wardrobe that it costs, like the real cost could be up as all the way to 150. And sometimes they ask, why 150 for a skirt? But if a ballet school asks for the same money, 150, just an example. It's just a tutu, very short, not a lot of fabric. And you can just made it, right? And duplicate it in a lot of different styles. So it's the same. The cultural outfits are expensive, are hard to get, and are unique. And if you compare to a tutu, why don't pay the same if we are requiring that budget for that specific wardrobe? So I would suggest that learn a little bit more about the cultures and why it is important not only to value the work made by those people who create the wardrobes, but also the respect to the cultures, because our cultures should be respected in every way. Language, price, fair wage, fair pay for the artists, for the teachers, for the instructors, for the people in our community, that they go the extra 2-3 miles to do the work without the money. Can you imagine what we can do with the support of the funders? So I like to thank all the funders because they are amazing on trying to support our communities, but I think they should be more training about the communities they serve or they want to support.
Thank you. Thank you. Vanessa, let me go to you. What do you want the funders to know?
So I've been talked to for funders like, sorry, we only support this, or sorry, we only support this. I think language can fit in any way, shape, or form. It is who we are, and it's our worldview. You can make it work. You just got to really look into it and really reflect on your foundation's past. When was it created? What was going on historically that it is a no to Indigenous communities? Really take a look at that, and maybe it's time to reevaluate yourselves to make sure that you're not gatekeeping or holding back funds that are rights. So I think that's where I'll end. Damn.
Julie, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you want the funders to know?
I think the question always is, if you really want to make change and you really want to see justice served, then I think taking a look at how you see a project and the work they're doing. And what I mean is, for example, I will often get told no because they say, we don't support youth development. To me is insane, because when you're talking about a community like ours, youth development is community development. And I don't think it's being dramatic when I say investment in youth is, if we don't, we're talking about the total loss of language. We're talking about the survival of a nation. It is that critical. So I think you also have to look at another thing I think you have to think about is like, what is success to the community? You know, I know that, you know, foundations and funders have their ideas about, well, this is what success looks like. But I feel like you really need to open your mind and say, what does success look like from an Indigenous perspective? What does it look like to them? You know, where to me, it means, you know, community development, it means wellness, it means so many things. But I'm concerned about, you know, our young people, are they living their Lakota values? Are they, you know, it may not be fast, but are they learning their language? Are they good relatives? I think that we see success in our Indigenous communities a little differently. And I think that those initiatives can be funded, you know, but I also feel like be ready for some long-term investment, because the pain that brought us to the point that we're in will not be healed overnight. And so I think that broadening your idea of like, we don't serve this or we serve this is number one. I think that's really, really important. But also like looking at the community's idea of success. You know, I know some kids that are coming from the harshest, toughest circumstances. So when they finish an internship of 50 hours and they do great, or they participate in our youth employment initiative, that's huge to me, because they've overcome so much to get there. And so like, I'm in it with them. I'm like, okay, then what can we do next? So I think that long term, but also seeing things from an Indigenous perspective, and also widening your minds about, you know, that youth development is community development. Youth development is investment in culture. And it's all one big picture, because we're all a community and we're all a tribe, we're all a nation, and we're all working to make life better for ourselves. But we have a really painful history and we lack resources. So being able to come in and talk to an organization like ours, like the Cheyenne River Youth Project, I would have a really open conversation with you about where we're at. So, I mean, those are just kind of, I mean, I have plenty more thoughts, but I think that those are ones that I would leave you with.
Thank you, Julie. And I think looking at the clock, there's a really great question in the chat, but I think I'm gonna have to hand it back to Rena to close us out. Thank you so much to our panelists, and for sharing such personal stories and experiences and such valuable and important insights. Rena?
Thank you, Shantel. On behalf of the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, thank you so much, Shantel and Vanessa and Julie and Veronica, for sharing your experiences with us and for trusting us with those stories and helping us to think more about language and culture. I think we've begun talking about that more, at least in some of the education and early childhood circles that we're in. But we're certainly not connecting the dots between education and early childhood and community development and youth development. We have a lot of work to do. So we really appreciate you helping us frame that conversation. And going back to what Ellen said at the beginning about cascading effects, I can't think of a more powerful cascading effect than giving children and young people the power and the ability to express themselves in all the languages that they speak, with the power of all of their culture and traditions behind them. So thank you. We're really looking forward to the next episode in this Infant Nation series on September 10th, toward a climate of care in learning programs. In that conversation, we're going to connect the growing movement for climate justice with learning environments. those two things are often siloed, education in one bucket and climate change in another, but there are a lot of intersections and opportunities where we think we can come together to make some real change for kids in learning environments. We're really excited to have Joan Lombardi, who's an international expert on child development and social policy, joining us. She's at the forefront of the intersection of climate change and early childhood. And we're especially excited to have Alicia Lanier, founder and CEO of the Urban Sprouts Early Child Development Center in St. Louis, joining us. We had the opportunity to visit with Alicia and the Urban Sprouts staff and kids recently, and they are inspiring and doing some real creative, innovative things that are connecting kids to environment and the world around them. So I hope that we'll see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much again. We just wanted to reiterate the thanks to all of our speakers, to Shantel for moderating this conversation, to all of you for your candor, vulnerability, and transparency in the conversation today. We really appreciate your time and the provocations that you have for all of us around really the criticality and what's at stake when we think about cultural and language preservation for all of our young people. By way of reminders and closeout, the video recording from today's session will be available in about 1 week, so we will share that out with each of you. We love for you to stay connected to what's happening at Grantmakers for Education, so you can use the QR code you see here to sign up for updates. And in addition to the September 10th, part 3 of this series, we hope that you'll join us. There are some additional programs that we'll be offering throughout the fall, so we hope to see you at a future program of ours. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. You enjoy the rest of your week.